On a perfect summer morning in 2023, a young woman named Amy Turner stood at the edge of a trailhead in Grand Teton National Park, her backpack packed with everything she needed for a solo adventure through some of the most beautiful and rugged terrain in America. She was 24, full of life, and deeply passionate about photography and the outdoors. She had spent weeks planning this trip, a 4-day trek through paintbrush and Cascade Canyons, not as a daredevil seeking thrills, but as an artist chasing the perfect sunrise. Her parents, her friends, even the strangers she met along the way, all remember her as someone thoughtful, prepared, and deeply connected to nature. She sent one last message to her mom before disappearing into the wilderness. "Off I go. The mountains are calling." That was the last time anyone ever heard from her. 11 months later, deep in the heart of the Teton Range, a park ranger named David Chen was hiking along a remote ridge, binoculars around his neck, scanning the cliffs for golden eagle nests. As part of his annual wildlife survey, he had no idea that what he was about to find would change everything everyone thought they knew about Amy Turner's disappearance. What he saw inside that nest was so strange, so unsettling, that it would reopen a cold case, reignite a desperate search, and uncover a truth far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of how one woman's love for the mountains led her into the path of something no one could have predicted, and how a bird of prey became the silent witness to a nightmare hidden in America's most beautiful wilderness. What David found inside that eagle's nest will shock you and leave you wondering how something like this could remain hidden for so long. Keep watching, because the truth is just beginning to unfold. The discovery of the items inside the golden eagle's nest sent shockwaves through the investigation. It wasn't just that something had been found, it was what had been found, and where. The red-trimmed underwear, the torn piece of nylon, these weren't random scraps of trash. They were pieces of Amy Turner's life, or what was left of it, and they had traveled an unthinkable distance, carried by a bird of prey that had no idea it was holding the final clue in a year-long mystery. The Park Service moved fast. Within hours, a full forensic team was dispatched to the area. The nest was treated like a crime scene. Every fiber, every feather, every bit of debris was carefully catalogued. Investigators worked in silence, their minds racing with the implications. If the eagle had scavenged from Amy's body, that meant her remains were somewhere nearby, or had been, before the elements and wildlife took their toll. The search was no longer about finding a lost hiker, it was about recovering a victim. But nothing about this case had ever been simple. The terrain around the nest was brutal, sheer cliffs, loose rock, and dense underbrush that made movement slow and dangerous. Every step had to be calculated. Every inch of ground had to be searched. The team moved in a tight grid, scanning the slope with metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and cadaver dogs trained to detect the faintest traces of human remains. For 2 full days, they found nothing. No bones, no clothing. No sign that Amy had ever been there. Doubt crept in. Had the eagle carried the items from somewhere else? Could the wind have blown them into the nest? Or worse, had the killer taken them from her body and left them behind, a twisted calling card? The possibilities were endless, and none of them offered comfort. Back in Salt Lake City, Amy's parents waited. Her father, Mark, had spent the last year combing the mountains himself, searching for something, anything that would bring him closer to his daughter. He had gone through every possible scenario in his mind, from the most hopeful to the most horrifying. But now, as the days passed and the silence from the search team stretched on, he felt the weight of something new. Not just grief, but dread. The kind of dread that comes when you realize the truth might be worse than anything you imagined. He kept going through old photos, reading her journal entries, listening to voice messages she had left her mother. She had been so full of life, so full of purpose, and now, she was reduced to a forensic puzzle, a name in a case file. A story whispered in the halls of the ranger station. The online forums were already buzzing. The same amateur sleuths who had speculated endlessly about Amy's disappearance were now dissecting the new evidence with a feverish intensity. Some believed the discovery in the eagle's nest proved she had been murdered. Others thought it was just another twist in a case that refused to be solved. The name Robert Fraser had already started to surface, not because he had been identified yet, but because the composite sketch of the Teton Phantom matched descriptions. From other missing persons cases, people were connecting dots that hadn't been connected before. They were asking questions about other hikers who had vanished in the Rockies, about unsolved disappearances that had gone cold years ago. Was it possible that Amy wasn't the first? Was it possible that someone had been using the wilderness as a hunting ground for years? The park rangers didn't comment. The sheriff's office didn't release names. But the pressure was building. The discovery had reignited the case, and now, everyone wanted answers. The local news stations ran updates every night. The national networks picked up the story. Even people who had never heard of Grand Teton National Park were suddenly watching footage of the mountains, hearing about the hiker who had gone in and never come out. The narrative was shifting. It was no longer just a tragic disappearance. It was a murder investigation, and the clock was ticking. Then, on the third morning of the search, something changed. One of the dogs, a black lab named Odin, gave a sharp alert near a cluster of boulders at the base of a steep slope. His handler called it in immediately. The team converged on the spot, carefully clearing away brush and loose dirt. What they found wasn't much, just a few fragments of blue fabric, a piece of what looked like a hiking boot sole, and a partial human bone. It wasn't enough to confirm anything, but it was enough to justify digging deeper. The forensic anthropologist on site, Dr. Alana Rios, took over. She worked with quiet precision, directing the team as they expanded the search area. Hours passed. Then, just before sunset, they uncovered something that made everyone stop. It was a shallow grave, barely 2 feet deep, just enough to cover the remains with a thin layer of soil and rocks. Inside, the skeleton of a young woman lay curled in the earth. The clothing was tattered, the bones weathered, but the location and the proximity to the eagle's nest was too precise to be a coincidence. The team worked quickly, documenting everything before airlifting the remains out. The official identification wouldn't come for another 24 hours, but everyone already knew. This was Amy Turner. The news reached her parents by phone. A ranger from the Park Service called Mark directly. He didn't say much, just that they had found her, that they were bringing her home. Mark didn't cry. He just sat there, staring at the mountains from his porch, the weight of it all pressing down on him like a stone. He had spent a year searching for his daughter. Now, he had found her buried in the dirt, hidden in the wilderness she had loved so much. The joy she had felt on that final morning, standing at the trailhead with her backpack on, was gone, replaced by something dark, something cruel. But the discovery of her body was only the beginning. The autopsy would reveal the full horror of what had happened to her, and that was when the case took its darkest turn yet. The fractures on her skull, the signs of a violent struggle, the evidence of sexual assault, all of it pointed to one undeniable truth. Amy had been murdered, and whoever had done this had left her there like she didn't matter, like she was just another piece of the landscape, something to be discarded and forgotten. The investigation was no longer about finding a missing person. It was about finding a killer. And the only lead they had was the man in the sketch, the intense hiker with the military-style backpack. The one who had been seen just hours before Amy disappeared. The one who had never been identified. The one who had walked into the mountains and vanished like he had done it before. And now, after more than a year, the clock was finally ticking in the right direction. The discovery of Amy Turner's remains, and the arrest of Robert Frazier sent shockwaves through the small mountain town of Jackson and beyond. But for all the answers it provided, it also opened up a flood of new questions that no one could easily answer. How had a man like Frazier, with a history of violence, managed to stay under the radar for so long? How many other trails had he walked? How many other lives had he taken? And how many families were still waiting for the kind of closure the Turners had finally received? The investigation was far from over. If anything, it had just begun. Frazier didn't talk much at first. He sat in his cell at the Teton County Jail, silent and unmoving, as if daring the world to try and understand him. His public defender, a weary but competent local attorney named Karen Delaney, tried to push for a mental health evaluation, hoping to argue diminished capacity or some kind of dissociative state. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. The evidence was too overwhelming, the confession too coldly detailed. Frazier wasn't crazy, he was calculating, and he knew exactly what he had done. But even behind bars, Frazier held power. He had lived his life like a ghost, moving from state to state, job to job, never leaving a trace. His digital footprint was practically non-existent. He didn't own a phone, didn't use social media, didn't even have a bank account in his own name. He paid for everything in cash, kept his belongings in a single duffel bag, and avoided any kind of permanent address. He was a man who had learned how to disappear long before he ever stepped foot in Grand Teton National Park. The more investigators dug into his past, the more they realized how deep his patterns ran. He had worked construction jobs in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Idaho. He always stayed just long enough to earn enough money to keep moving, never making friends, never drawing attention. But now, with his name in the system and his face plastered across every news station in the country, he had nowhere left to run. What troubled the investigators most wasn't just what Frazier had done, but how he had done it. He had studied the wilderness like a predator studies its prey. He knew the trails, the backcountry routes, the places where people went to be alone. He knew how to move without being seen, how to track someone without being noticed, and he had used that knowledge to hunt. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit got involved, poring over every detail of Frazier's life, trying to build a profile that might help prevent something like this from happening again. They found disturbing patterns, not just in his movements, but in his behavior. He had a history of targeting women who were hiking alone, often in remote areas with limited cell service. He didn't just attack them, he stalked them, he watched them, he learned their routines before he ever made his move. One of the lead agents, Special Agent Marcus Bell, described Frazier as a shadow hunter. He didn't rely on brute force, he relied on patience, on observation, on the vastness of the wilderness to cover his tracks. And that made him even more dangerous. Because if he had done this before, and the evidence suggested he had, then there were likely other victims whose remains had never been found. The Turners, still reeling from the loss of their daughter, were determined to find out the truth. Mark Turner, who had spent over a year combing the mountains in search of Amy, now found himself combing through police reports, witness statements, and forensic documents, trying to piece together the final hours of her life. He wasn't a detective, but he was a man with nothing left to lose, and he wasn't going to stop until he knew everything. Sarah Turner, Amy's mother, struggled to find peace. She would sit for hours in Amy's old apartment, surrounded by her daughter's photographs, her journals, her unfinished projects. She read and reread every message Amy had ever sent her, every voicemail she had saved, trying to hold on to the sound of her voice. But every time she closed her eyes, all she could see was the image of that shallow grave. The way Amy had been buried like she didn't matter. The media, of course, latched onto the case with a kind of obsessive intensity. News crews set up outside the courthouse in Jackson, broadcasting live updates every hour. True crime podcasts dissected every detail, from Frazier's past to the forensic evidence found in the Eagle's Nest. Online forums exploded with speculation, with theories, with accusations that the Park Service had failed Amy, that the search had been inadequate, that the system had let her down. But for all the noise, for all the headlines, the real story was still unfolding behind closed doors. The prosecution was preparing to take Frazier to trial, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. He had no remorse, no fear, no sense of guilt. He was a man who had spent his life in the shadows, and he wasn't about to step into the light now. And then there was the matter of the camera, the Nikon D750. That had been found in Frazier's possession was more than just evidence. It was a window into Amy's final moments. The photos she had taken on the trail, the landscapes she had captured, with such care and precision, were haunting in their beauty. But it was the last few images, the ones Frazier had taken, that chilled everyone who saw them. They were clinical, cold. He had documented everything. Not just the assault, but the way Amy had fought back, the terror in her eyes, the way she had tried to run. And then, finally, the silence. The FBI forensic team worked tirelessly to recover every last detail from the memory card, hoping to find something, anything that might help build an even stronger case. But the deeper they looked, the more unsettling the patterns became. Frazier hadn't just taken Amy's life, he had taken pieces of her, memories of her, moments that were never meant to be seen by anyone else. And then there was the question of the other items found in his possession, the driver's licenses, the jewelry, the locks of hair. They belonged to other women, women who had vanished in different parts of the Rockies, their disappearances never linked, their cases never solved. The FBI launched a nationwide review of missing persons reports, cross-referencing names, locations, and timeline. They started reaching out to families, asking for DNA samples, offering hope where there had been none before. But for every new lead, for every new name that came up, the weight of the unknown grew heavier. How many more women had Frazier taken? How many more families were still waiting? And more importantly, was he really working alone? That was the question that haunted Mark Turner the most. He couldn't shake the feeling that Frazier had been watching Amy for longer than anyone realized, that he had been planning his attack for days, maybe even weeks. And if that was true, then maybe he had help. Maybe there were others like him, predators who used the wilderness as their hunting ground, who knew how to disappear, how to cover their tracks. He started reaching out to other families, connecting with people whose loved ones had vanished under similar circumstances. He shared his story, listened to theirs, compared notes, and the more he learned, the more he realized how many gaps there were in the system, how many unanswered questions, how many cold cases that had never been properly investigated. The mountains had given up one of their darkest secrets, but they still held others. And Mark Turner wasn't done searching. The courtroom was silent, but the weight of every word hung thick in the air. Robert Frazier sat motionless, his expression unreadable, as the prosecution played the final set of images from Amy Turner's camera. The screen flickered with the last photos ever taken of her, not the ones she had intended to capture, not the sunrise she had dreamed of photographing, but the cold, calculated snapshots of her terror. The room felt smaller with each frame, like the walls were closing in. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Amy's parents sat in the front row, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white, their eyes locked on the screen like they were trying to pull her back through time. The lead prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rachel Delgado, stood and walked slowly toward the jury box. She didn't need to say much. The photos had done the talking for her. This man, she said, her voice steady and low, didn't just take a life. He documented it, he preserved it, he kept it as a trophy, like it was something to be proud of. She paused, letting the words settle, and he didn't stop with Amelia Turner. The room stirred. The judge rapped his gavel once, signaling for order. The next piece of evidence was a map, a large, projected image on the courtroom screen. It showed a string of red pins scattered across the western United States: Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. Each pin marked the last known location of a missing woman. Some names were familiar to the public. Others had never made headlines. But now, with Frazier's confession and the items found in his possession, the dots were finally connecting. The FBI had been working non-stop since his arrest, combing through missing persons reports, comparing DNA samples, following every lead. That had once gone cold. What they were uncovering was worse than anyone had imagined. Frazier had been hunting for years, moving from state to state, always staying just long enough to find his next victim before disappearing again. He was a ghost, a predator who had learned to use the vastness of the wilderness to his advantage. And now, for the first time, the families of those women had something they had never had before: a name. But even with the growing evidence, even with the overwhelming weight of the case, Frazier remained calm. He didn't react to the photos. He didn't flinch at the sound of Amy's name. He didn't even blink when the prosecution brought in the final piece of evidence, the confession he had given to investigators. Just days after his arrest, "I didn't plan it," he had said in the interrogation room, his voice as flat as the desert plains. "I saw her. I followed her. She fought. I stopped her." The words played through the courtroom speakers like a recording from a nightmare. The defense attorney, Karen Delaney, tried to argue that Frazier was mentally unstable, that he wasn't fully responsible for his actions. But the jury didn't buy it. They had seen the trophies. They had heard the confession. They had looked into the eyes of a man who knew exactly what he had done and didn't care. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy was at a boiling point. News vans lined the street, reporters shouting updates into their microphones, cameras flashing with every statement from the attorneys. Online, the story had gone viral again. Reddit threads exploded with theories. True crime podcasters dissected every detail. And in small towns across the Rockies, hikers and outdoor lovers were rethinking their plans, double-checking their safety protocols, whispering Frazier's name like it was some kind of curse. But while the world watched the trial unfold, another story was still playing out behind the scenes, one that hadn't made the headlines yet. Back in Grand Teton National Park, Ranger David Chen was still going through his notes from the day he found the eagle's nest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. The location of Amy's body, the way it had been buried, the items that had been taken, none of it fit perfectly with Frazier's confession. He had described the attack in detail, but there were inconsistencies. Small things, like the exact placement of the grave, the condition of the remains, the way the items had been scattered through the nest. Chen wasn't a detective. He wasn't even officially part of the investigation. But he was a man who had spent his life studying patterns, the patterns of birds, of weather, of the land. And something about this case still felt off. He started going through the search logs again, comparing them to the maps he had drawn during his eagle surveys. He overlaid satellite images with elevation data, marking every possible path Frazier could have taken after the murder. He cross-referenced everything with the timeline the prosecution had presented in court. And then he found it. A small, almost imperceptible detail buried in the data, a second trail of disturbed earth. Just a few hundred yards from where Amy's body had been found. It was faint, almost invisible to the naked eye, but when he zoomed in, when he adjusted the contrast, it became clear that there had been another burial. Not Frazier's, not Amy's, someone else. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He immediately called the lead investigator on the case, but the line went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, he sent an urgent email with his findings, attaching the satellite overlay and the coordinates of the new site. Then he did something he probably shouldn't have. He packed his gear and headed back into the mountains. The area was remote, even by Teton standards. It was deep in the backcountry, far from any established trails, accessible only by a steep climb and a narrow ridge that dropped off on both sides. As he hiked, Chen couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. The forest was too quiet. The wind had stopped. Even the birds were silent. When he finally reached the coordinates, he took a deep breath and started digging. The first few inches of soil were soft, easy to move. Then his shovel hit something solid. Not rock, something else. He dropped to his knees and started clearing the dirt with his hands, his heart pounding. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. A second grave, and inside it, another set of remains. But this one was different. The clothing was newer. The positioning of the bones suggested a different cause of death. And most disturbing of all, there was no official record of anyone disappearing in this area. Chen stood up slowly, his hands shaking. He looked around, suddenly aware of how alone he was. The mountains that had always felt like a sanctuary now felt like something else entirely. He pulled out his radio and called for backup. But as he waited, as the wind picked up and the shadows stretched longer across the ridge, one thought kept running through his mind. Frazier had confessed to killing Amy Turner, but he hadn't told the whole truth, and whoever had buried this second body, they were still out there. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet intensity in the days following Frazier's conviction, but for all the horror his confession had revealed, something still didn't sit right with the lead investigator, Detective Marcus Bell. He had spent decades chasing predators, peeling back the layers of their minds. And something about Frazier's story felt too clean, too rehearsed, like he was telling the truth, but not all of it. The confession was chilling in its detail, but it lacked something Bell had come to expect from killers like him. Bragging. Frazier didn't boast about his crimes. He didn't revel in the terror he had caused. He simply described them, like he was reading from a script. And then there was the second grave Ranger Chen had uncovered, a grave that didn't belong to Amy, a grave that hadn't been mentioned in Frazier's confession at all. Bell had gone over the case files again and again, cross-referencing every name, every location, every detail. He had worked with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to build a full psychological profile of Frazier, hoping to find patterns, to understand what made him tick. What they found was disturbing, not because it confirmed what they already knew, but because it hinted at something more. Frazier had a history of working construction jobs in remote mountain towns, always under the table, always in cash. He moved from state to state, job to job, like a ghost. But there was one place he kept returning to on his travel records. A small, isolated town in northern Montana, nestled deep in the Rockies, a place called Eureka. Eureka wasn't on any major hiking trails. It wasn't a tourist destination. It was a town of barely 2,000 people, surrounded by dense forest and steep ridgelines, the kind of place where outsiders didn't stay long unless they had a reason to. Bell started digging into missing persons reports from the area. At first, there was nothing unusual, just a handful of cold cases, mostly older men who had gone missing during hunting season, a couple of hikers who had wandered off trail and were never found. But then he found her. Her name was Jessica Morales. She was 26 when she vanished in the spring of 2022, just a year before Amy Turner disappeared. She had been hiking alone in the nearby Cabinet Mountains, a remote and rugged range known for its dense forests and unpredictable weather. She was an experienced hiker, meticulous in her planning. Just like Amy, she had sent a final message to her sister the night before she vanished. A photo of her campsite, a short note, "Perfect view tonight. See you Sunday." She never made it back. Bell stared at the details on his screen, his pulse quickening. Everything about her disappearance mirrored Amy's. Same pattern, same silence, same lack of evidence. And then he saw it, the final piece that sent a chill down his spine. Jessica Morales had been wearing a pair of red-trimmed underwear the day she vanished. The same color, the same style, the same trophy. He immediately contacted the sheriff's office in Eureka, requesting any and all records related to her case. Within hours, he had a name, one that made his stomach twist. The lead investigator on Jessica's disappearance had been a local deputy named Carl Hensley, a man who had worked in the area for over 20 years. Bell ran a background check and found something even more disturbing. Hensley had been fired 6 months after Jessica's case went cold, accused of mishandling evidence and failing to follow up on critical leads. The official report was vague, citing internal misconduct, but there were whispers, rumors of a man who had buried the truth, who had protected someone, or something, no one could quite explain. Bell didn't believe in coincidences. He dug deeper, requesting sealed records, filing formal requests with the Montana Department of Justice. What he found was even worse than he had imagined. Jessica's case had been closed within weeks of her disappearance, despite the fact that no body had ever been found, no credible leads had been pursued, and no search efforts had been launched beyond the most basic. It was as if the entire investigation had been a cover-up, a deliberate attempt to erase her from the system. And then came the final blow. A search of Hensley's personal property, conducted after his termination, had turned up a disturbing collection of items, driver's licenses, photographs, and a single hiking boot, still caked in dried mud. The boot was later identified as belonging to a missing woman named Rebecca Lang, a 31-year-old backpacker who had vanished in the same area nearly a decade earlier. The case had gone cold, like so many others, but now, with Hensley's name tied to it, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Bell's hands trembled as he stared at the screen. He had spent years chasing monsters, but this was something different. This wasn't just a killer. This was a network. He immediately contacted the Teton County Sheriff's Office, requesting a full review of Frazier's interrogation transcripts. He wanted to know everything Frazier had said about Eureka, about Hensley, about Jessica Morales. Every word, every pause, every detail. What he found made his blood run cold. Frazier had mentioned Eureka twice during his confession. Once when describing how he had learned to disappear, how he had learned to move through the wilderness without leaving a trace. And again when he described the first time he had killed. She was in Montana, he had said, almost offhandedly. A long time ago. I think her name was Jess. No one had followed up. No one had asked for more details. The prosecutors had been focused on Amy Turner, on securing a conviction, and Frazier had played into that focus, giving them just enough to satisfy the case without revealing the full extent of his crimes. Bell sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. If Frazier had killed Jessica Morales, then where was her body? And if Hensley had been involved in covering it up, how many other cases had been buried under the same silence? The mountains had already taken one life. Now, it seemed, they had taken many more. And the worst part, they had done it with help from someone who was supposed to protect them. The courtroom was silent, but the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone inside. Robert Frazier sat motionless, his face unreadable, as the judge read the final verdict. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was life without parole, a decision that brought a wave of relief to the families in the room, but no real peace. Justice had been served, but it wouldn't bring Amy Turner back. It wouldn't erase the horror of what had been done to her. Her parents sat in the front row, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white. They had waited over a year for this moment, but it didn't feel like closure. It felt like the end of one chapter in a nightmare that would never truly fade. Outside, the world reacted. News vans lined the streets, reporters shouting updates into their microphones, cameras flashing with every statement from the attorneys. Online, the story had gone viral again. Reddit threads exploded with theories. True crime podcasters dissected every detail. And in small towns across the Rockies, hikers and outdoor lovers were rethinking their plans, double-checking their safety protocols, whispering Frazier's name like it was some kind of curse. But while the media celebrated the conviction, while the public breathed a collective sigh of relief, one man still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Detective Marcus Bell sat alone in his office, the glow of his computer screen the only light in the room. He had spent the last year chasing monsters, peeling back layers, and now, with Frazier behind bars, he should have felt something: satisfaction, maybe even exhaustion. But instead, all he felt was unease. Frazier's confession had been chilling in its detail, but it had also been incomplete. He had described the attack on Amy with clinical precision, but there were inconsistencies, small things, like the exact placement of the grave, the condition of the remains, the way the items had been scattered through the nest. And then, there was the second grave Ranger Chen had uncovered, a grave that didn't belong to Amy, a grave that hadn't been mentioned in Frazier's confession at all. Bell had gone over the case files again and again, cross-referencing every name, every location, every detail. What he found was disturbing, not because it confirmed what they already knew, but because it hinted at something more. Frazier had a history of working construction jobs in remote mountain towns, always under the table, always in cash. He moved from state to state, job to job, like a ghost. But there was one place he kept returning to on his travel records, a small, isolated town in northern Montana, nestled deep in the Rockies, a place called Eureka. And now, Bell had a named Carl Hensley, a former deputy sheriff who had been fired for mishandling evidence in the case of Jessica Morales, a woman who had vanished in 2022. The same red-trimmed underwear, the same hiking boot, the same trophy. Bell's hands trembled as he stared at the screen. He had spent years chasing monsters. But this was something different. This wasn't just a killer. This was a network. And then came the final blow. Frazier had mentioned Eureka twice during his confession, once when describing how he had learned to disappear, how he had learned to move through the wilderness without leaving a trace, and again when he described the first time he had killed. She was in Montana, he had said, almost offhandedly, a long time ago. I think her name was Jess. No one had followed up. No one had asked for more details. The prosecutors had been focused on Amy Turner, on securing a conviction, and Frazier had played into that focus, giving them just enough to satisfy the case without revealing the full extent of his crimes. Bell sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. If Frazier had killed Jessica Morales, then where was her body? And if Hensley had been involved in covering it up, how many other cases had been buried under the same silence? The mountains had already taken one life. Now it seemed, they had taken many more, and the worst part, they had done it with help from someone who was supposed to protect them. The news of Frazier's conviction had barely settled when another story began to unfold, one that hadn't made the headlines yet. Back in Grand Teton National Park, Ranger David Chen was still going through his notes from the day he found the eagle's nest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. The location of Amy's body, the way it had been buried, the items that had been taken, none of it fit perfectly with Frazier's confession. He had described the attack in detail, but there were inconsistencies. Small things, like the exact placement of the grave, the condition of the remains, the way the items had been scattered through the nest. Chen wasn't a detective. He wasn't even officially part of the investigation. But he was a man who had spent his life studying patterns, the patterns of birds, of weather, of the land. And something about this case still felt off. he started going through the search logs again, comparing them to the maps he had drawn during his Eagle surveys. He overlaid satellite images with elevation data, marking every possible path Frazier could have taken after the murder. He cross-referenced everything with the timeline the prosecution had presented in court. And then he found it, a small, almost imperceptible detail buried in the data, a second trail of disturbed earth, just a few hundred yards from where Amy's body had been found. It was faint, almost invisible to the naked eye, but when he zoomed in, when he adjusted the contrast, it became clear. There had been another burial. Not Frazier's, not Amy's, someone else. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Immediately, called the lead investigator on the case, but the line went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, he sent an urgent email with his findings, attaching the satellite overlay and the coordinates of the new site. Then he did something he probably shouldn't have. He packed his gear and headed back into the mountains. The area was remote, even by Teton standards. It was deep in the backcountry, far from any established trails, accessible only by a steep climb and a narrow ridge that dropped off on both sides. As he hiked, Chen couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. The forest was too quiet. The wind had stopped. Even the birds were silent. When he finally reached the coordinates, he took a deep breath and started digging. The first few inches of soil were soft, easy to move. Then his shovel hit something solid. Not rock. Something else. He dropped to his knees and started clearing the dirt with his hands, his heart pounding. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. A second grave, and inside it, another set of remains. But this one was different. The clothing was newer. The positioning of the bones suggested a different cause of death. And most disturbing of all, there was no official record of anyone disappearing in this area. Chen stood up slowly, his hands shaking. He looked around, suddenly aware of how alone he was. The mountains that had always felt like a sanctuary now felt like something else entirely. He pulled out his radio and called for backup. But as he waited, as the wind picked up and the shadows stretched longer across the ridge, one thought kept running through his mind. Frazier had confessed to killing Amy Turner. But he hadn't told the whole truth, and whoever had buried this second body, they were still out there, and they were still hunting. The mountains remained silent as the news of Robert Frazier's conviction spread through Jackson and beyond. For the first time in over a year, the name Amelia Turner was no longer just a mystery whispered among hikers and park rangers. It was a story of justice, of resilience, of a family's unbreakable love. But for all the answers the trial had provided, for all the horrifying details that had finally been spoken aloud, the pain of Amy's loss never truly faded. It simply changed shape, settling into the hearts of those who loved her like a scar that never quite heals. Mark and Sarah Turner stood at the edge of the overlook where Amy had once taken one of her most breathtaking photographs. The cathedral, peaks reflected in the still waters of Jenny Lake. The same place where Amy had paused to soak in the beauty of the world around her, where she had smiled for a stranger's camera just days before she vanished, was now the place where they said goodbye. The wind was sharp that morning, carrying with it the scent of pine and snow, and the sky was a deep, endless blue. It was a perfect day, just like the one she had stepped into more than a year ago. They buried Amy in a quiet ceremony, surrounded by those who had known and loved her, her roommate, Chloe, her childhood friends, the park rangers who had never stopped searching, the strangers who had followed her story and felt like they had known her too. Her father spoke again, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed the weight of everything they had endured. He talked about Amy's love for the wilderness, her quiet strength, the way she had always believed in the goodness of the world. He thanked the people who had helped bring her home, the investigators, the search teams, the rangers who had never given up hope. And then he thanked David Chen, the man who had found her. The Golden Eagle's nest had been a cruel twist of fate, a piece of evidence carried by the very thing that Amy had admired most, the wild, untamed beauty of the mountains. But it had also been the key to everything. Without Ranger Chen's sharp eye, without his instinct to clean what he thought was trash, Amy's story might have remained a mystery forever. He had been the one to pull her from the silence, to give her parents the answers they had searched for in every rock, every shadow, every empty trail. The weeks that followed were filled with media coverage, with interviews and headlines that painted Amy's story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of the backcountry. True crime podcasts dissected every detail of Frazier's crimes, warning hikers to never walk alone, to always tell someone their route, to carry a satellite beacon. The National Park Service updated their safety protocols, reminding visitors that the wilderness was not just beautiful, it was unpredictable, and sometimes it hid monsters. But for Amy's parents, the most important lesson wasn't about safety or preparation. It was about resilience, about the way a father had refused to let his daughter be forgotten, about the way a stranger had found a clue in the most impossible place, about the way a community had come together to fight for a woman who had been taken from the world too soon. Frazier was sentenced to life in prison without parole, his name now synonymous with the darkest corners of the wilderness. His confession had led investigators to other bodies, to other families who had been waiting for answers for years. In the end, he had been more than just a killer, he had been a ghost. A predator who had used the vastness of the mountains to hide his crimes. And now, thanks to Amy's story, thanks to the relentless search that had never truly ended, he would never hurt anyone again. But the mountains remained. They still stood tall, still caught the first light of dawn, still whispered their secrets to those who dared to listen. And for every hiker who stepped onto the trail with a backpack and a camera, Amy's story lingered, not as a warning to stay away, but as a reminder to be aware, to be prepared, to carry her memory with them as they explored the beauty she had loved so much. In the months that followed, the Turners worked with local outdoor organizations to create a scholarship in Amy's name for young photographers who wanted to capture the wilderness in its purest form. They donated her gear. 2 local schools encouraged young women to explore the outdoors, to chase the same sunrises Amy had once dreamed of photographing. Her images remained online, shared by thousands, each one a testament to the life she had lived, the passion she had carried, the beauty she had seen in the world. And though she was gone, her story endured. It lived in the quiet determination of her father, in the quiet strength of her mother, in the quiet reverence of every hiker who passed through Paintbrush Canyon and thought of the young woman who had walked those trails alone. It lived in the eagle's nest that had given up its secret, in the ranger who had followed his instincts, in the investigators who had refused to let the truth stay buried. That it lived in the mountains, and in the end, that was exactly where Amy would have wanted to be remembered.